loyalty to the king, which means they did what? If you search your loyalty to the king, are you loyal to him or disloyal to him? Very loyal. And they promised, quote, all due subordination to Parliament. They promised all due subordination to Parliament. What does that mean? They promised all due subordination. What does that mean, Charles? If they promise all due subordination to Parliament. How do you really get in trouble here? How could you get suspended out of school here other than taking drugs or chewing tobacco or smoking cigarettes? How do you get suspended out of here? You don't do what you're told. And you know what the term for that is? Insubordination. That's exactly it. When they say they promise all due subordination, that means they promise all do what you say to Parliament. If you're insubordinate, you're not doing what you're told. Very good, Sully. And kids get suspended out of school for insubordination, telling the teacher to fly off or whatever, not doing what you're told. Alexis, I want you to put your cell phone in that thing. No, I'm not doing it. That's insubordination. So if they promised all due subordination to Parliament, they are promising what? Do whatever they were told. Okay? Seems a lot, but that's what they did. The second thing they did is, even though they asserted their loyalty to the king and promised all due subordination to Parliament, they vowed to resist all taxes that were levied without the consent of their own legislatures. Think about that, we'll explain it. Okay? They would resist all taxes levied without the consent of their own legislators. What are their legislators? They're lawmakers back in the colonial assemblies. Now that's a good point, so I don't get the delegates mixed up with the legislators, because delegates were people that were chosen to talk about this. Legislators are people that are elected by the colonial assemblies to make the laws. They're like congressmen and senators that we have. So what they're saying here is, we're not paying any taxes levied unless our legislature, our government within our own colony, says it's okay. So again, what they're saying is, we're not going to pay any taxation without representation. If our colonial assemblies, our legislature says, yeah, pay that stamp tax, then we're going to pay it. But if they say, we're not paying that stamp tax because we don't have any representation, we're not. So those were the two things that they decided at that time. Is they would assert their loyalty to the king, and they'd promise all due subordination to Parliament, but they were not going to be taxed without what? Representation. Okay? Well, the third thing they did was even more important. They talked colonial merchants into signing non-importation agreements. I think that's on your ID sheet, is it not? Non-importation agreements. So this Stamp Act Congress, these delegates talked colonial merchants to sign non-importation agreements. Anybody know what that is? I'll be really impressed if you pull this off. You're a colonial merchant. You've decided, because of the situation going on around you, that you're going to sign non-importation agreements. Sully?
Maybe that they weren't going to accept imports from Britain, so they wouldn't have to pay taxes to them.
Unbelievable. Not only would they not import anything from Great Britain, they would not purchase anything from Great Britain, and they would not ship anything to Great Britain. Okay? Thinking what? What's that? What problem's that going to? What's that going to do? Is that going to put pressure on Great Britain? Because where does Great Britain sell a majority of their goods? To the colonies. Okay? That's right. Although it's not that yet. So, within just a few months of the non-importation agreements, products that were made in Great Britain virtually vanished from colonial stores and warehouses. In other words, there was nothing in there from Great Britain. Where were we getting our stuff? From France, whatever. And even beyond, even we were willing to pay the duty on it to Kind of reminds me, I hope I don't offend anybody by saying this, but it kind of reminds me, I'm a little worried about this new parts store. Anybody tied into that, so I've offended you? Yeah, auto part. Does anybody's dad own that? I don't want to offend anyone here. Anybody's dad own the new auto parts store, so I'm not offending anybody?
I wanted it to be one of these.
Yeah, me too. But here's my point on this. I'm a little worried about that because it's a big company. And so if they come in and even if they sell their stuff for a loss, you know what I mean? People run there and say, oh, I can buy a wrench for $3 cheaper than I can on Napa or the other, or AutoQuest or whatever it's called. Well, they're willing to, I'm not saying they're going to do this, I'm just making a point. They could be willing to take a loss for a year because they are a big company and run the other two out, and pretty soon that's a monopoly. Well, this is kind of the same idea here. These guys were trying to run Britain out, you know what I mean? We're not going to buy any more of your goods. We're not going to sell you anything. We're cutting you off. And because you sell a lot and buy a lot from us, you're going to feel the heat. And I'll tell you, it did make a big difference, okay? And we'll talk about it later. So within just a few months of these non-importation agreements being signed, you couldn't find virtually any products in the American colonies from Great Britain. Nothing in the warehouses, nothing in the stores. Now, each colony of I guess 9 of the 13 sent delegates to get things stirred up, am I right? Okay, well, American colonists didn't stand pat either, the lower class people, so to speak, or the people that weren't in the legislature. So colonists got together and they organized groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. Calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. And they did these 5 things to protest the Stamp Act. So Parliament's passed the Stamp Act, everybody's opposed to it, they've sent delegates to try to find out what they're going to do. They are not only going to not pay any taxes unless it's stated to do so by their legislatures, but they're also now signing non-importation agreements. The ball's rolling. Well, normal American colonists wanted to get in the act, and they organized groups of protest called the Sons of Liberty. And these are some of the actions they took to protest the Stamp Act. They rioted in large towns. They rioted in large towns in protest of the Stamp Act. The Sons of Liberty also destroyed the offices of the stamp tax collectors. So they had offices and they would go around collecting tax. Well, they destroyed the offices of the stamp tax collectors. They would take these stamps from the offices, and what would they do with them in the streets? Burn them. They burned the stamps in the streets. They actually destroyed houses of British officials that were living in the colonies. They destroyed the homes of British officials that were living in the colonies. And if you were a citizen, American colonist that seemed a little bit sympathetic to Great Britain or supportive of Great Britain, what do you think they did to you? No, not that they did. That killing would be too quick. What? Well, how'd they punish them? I've never had this happen, but I think it would be really tough. They tarred and feathered them. Now that sounds kind of weird because you really don't think about that, but what it really amounted to is throwing tar over a person and then throwing feathers on. That would take you like forever to get that off your body. It was a horrible punishment, so to speak. So they tarred and feathered. If you showed loyalty to Great Britain and supported their actions and they outwardly caught you, they would tar and feather you. Well, because of this rebellion on the part of the Sons of Liberty, what do you think Great Britain has to do? What?
Send in the military.
Well, there's some there already, but you're making a point. They sent in more. By 1770, in Boston alone, and that's where most of this stuff was taking place, was in Boston, there were 4,000 British soldiers in Boston because of what actions the Sons of Liberty were taking. So most of this protest is going on in Massachusetts, frankly, and in the Boston area. And because of the rebellion on the part of the Sons of Liberty, by 1770, there were 4,000 British soldiers in Boston. You know what that ratio was? 1 soldier for every 5 colonists. So you think about that. In this school, if we brought in a SRO, a school resource officer, and we had one for each 5 students, let's figure that out. There's 400 students. If you divide 400 by 5, what do you get? 80? Is that right?
Yeah.
I'm not a math major. Matter of fact, I'm a perfect example of how you can be a stunning success in life and have no mathematical skills whatsoever. But that would be 80 police officers in this school watching. A little overkill, you think? But that's what the ratio would be like. So there were 4,000 soldiers in the city of Boston by 1770, basically 1 to watch every 5 colonies. It'd be like having 80 police officers in here to watch you 400 kids. Okay, that'll take us to our last subtopic. It's called the repeal of the Stamp Act. Is that good news for the colonists? Repeal of the Stamp Act? Sure is. Well, Parliament is getting news of this colonial resistance in America. And King George even got involved by making this quote. And again, on these quotes I give you, only write them down if I tell you to. Otherwise, just listen. So this is the quote that King George III said. He said, quote, "It is undoubtedly the most serious matter that has ever come before Parliament." So he considered this rebellion in the American colonies the most serious matter that Parliament ever had to deal with. Okay? He had it pretty good. Okay? Now, what really caused the repeal of the Stamp Act? The Sons of Liberty and the violence that they did? Who went to Parliament and said, we got to repeal the Stamp Act? Who went to Parliament? Was it American colonists that went to Parliament and said, God, dang it, you better repeal this? Who went? Rachel, who went to Parliament and said, you got to repeal this? No? Good guess. What group of people went to the British Parliament and said, you got to repeal this thing? No, no. No? Good guesses.
No, Franklin went.
Who's getting hurt the most on this deal?
The British people.
Which type of merchants? The British merchants. And British merchants stormed into Parliament and said, hey, we're facing financial ruin. You must repeal the Stamp Act. So were the non-importation agreements working? They were working well. It wasn't so much the Sons of Liberty and the violence they were throwing around, although that shocked King George III in Parliament. What caused the repeal of the Stamp Act was the fact that British merchants were getting killed financially. Now, I'm going to get back to Rachel because she made a point. Believe it or not, there were some people in the Parliament that agreed with the colonists about taxation without representation. And one of those was, Rachel, Edmund Burke. He was a British leader in Parliament. He was a very famous British writer. And he supported the colonists in their fight in which he deemed illegal measures. He didn't think it was right either that you should have taxation without representation. So when the British merchants went to Parliament demanding they repeal it, and then you had some people, one in particular, Edmund Burke, who sided with the colonists that were serving in the Parliament, finally, in March of 1766, under heavy pressure, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. But it wasn't because of so much the Sons of Liberty as it was the British merchants were getting killed, and the colonists actually had some support in the British Parliament, including Edmund Burke. Well, to celebrate the repeal, the Sons of Liberty erected a huge flagpole in New York City that became known as the Liberty Pole. And everybody gathered around the Liberty Pole in New York City to celebrate the repeal of the Stamp Act. Well, Parliament was still going to show they were in control. So even though they repealed the Stamp Act and the American colonists were thrilled, they passed another one to just, excuse my French, piss them off. And that was the Declaratory Act of 1766. So Parliament was not going to go away easy. Okay? What they did is they said, yeah, we'll repeal this Stamp Act, because it's, you know, in the essence, it's really hurting us, you know. But, to let you know we're in charge, we're going to pass the Declaratory Act of 1766. And this is a law I want you to write down. This is what the Declaratory Act of 1766 stated. It stated that Parliament had, quote, Parliament had, quote, the full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. Again, the Declaratory Act of 1766 stated, quote, that Parliament had, quote, full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies. Full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies and people of America. Full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. Again, Parliament had the right to, quote, assert full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. Full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. Now, Julie, you are from Sweden, but even from Sweden, what does that tell you? If Parliament has the full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies and the people of America in all cases whatsoever, what's that telling you?
That they can do anything.
They can do anything they want. So they passed the Declaratory Act of 1766 and basically tell the American colonists, we can do whatever we want to. Okay? All right, fine job. Thanks for joining us, Maria. I hope you weren't bored too bad. You guys will continue on tomorrow with the Townsend Acts. That really irritated the American colonists.
The following students have items and messages in the office. McKenna Mickelson, Kimberly